Clock Tower was always one of those series that kind of sat in the background for me growing up. I remember seeing Clock Tower 3 in a game magazine and just thinking it looked really cool, but I never actually played the series back then. It was just one of those names that stuck with me. I didn't finally sit down with it until about a year ago, and it took a minute. At first, it felt slower than I was expecting, and it took a bit for me to understand what it was asking. But once it clicked, I really started to get into it. There were ideas in there that felt ahead of their time, and going back to the very first game now, you can see some of the groundwork for where horror games eventually went. So before survival horror had a clear identity, before the genre was fully defined, what was Clock Tower? Clock Tower came out in 1995 on the Super Famicom. It was made by Human Entertainment, and that's a big part of why it stands out. Human was mostly known for sports games, so seeing them drop this slow, creepy mansion horror game feels kind of like a left turn, and the way you play it makes that stand out even more. Your main tool is basically a cursor. You're clicking around rooms, checking objects, opening drawers, trying to figure out what the mansion's hiding from you. And the timing around this is important also. Console horror in the mid-90s was still forming. People weren't really using survival horror as this solid genre label yet. The pieces were there. There was darker action games, gothic stuff, and PC games like Alone in the Dark showing how much atmosphere and layout could really carry fear. And Clock Tower lands right in that moment. Leaning really hard into suspense and slow exploration instead of speed and action. A lot of the tension here comes from the mansion itself. Moving room to room, learning the layout, getting familiar with doors, staircases, trying to memorize where a hiding spot could be. The fixed camera style helps with that too, because every room feels framed like a scene almost. You're constantly reading the environment before you move around, and the pacing being slower actually works in its favor, because you spend enough time in the mansion that it really starts to immerse you in the world. Makes you feel like people really live there, like something actually happened. Jennifer as the protagonist really reinforces that whole idea even more. She's a teenage orphan, one of the girls adopted by the Barros family, and she walks into this mansion with no real power behind her. No weapons or training, nothing that really makes her feel prepared. So the game leans into survival as being aware of your surroundings, noticing what feels off, making the right moves at the right moments. For 1995, that's a really specific design choice. And you can see the inspiration sitting behind it too. Clock Tower pulls a lot from Italian horror, especially Dario Argento's Phenomena, and even Suspiria. The isolated mansion, the young girl, the stalker energy, it's all in there. The whole vibe of this runs on suspense, where the fear builds through mood and anticipation, and you feel like you're almost inside the scene or a movie while it's all happening. And the Japan-only release makes sense when you look at what this game actually is. In 1995, a slow, point-and-click suspense horror game with a vulnerable lead was always going to be a niche console release. It could find an audience in Japan, but selling that concept overseas was harder back then, and localization wasn't a simple step. So it launched in Japan on the Famicom and just stayed there. So Clock Tower builds its name in Japan first, and a couple years later it comes back on PlayStation in '97 as Clock Tower: The First Fear. It's essentially the same exact game, it just had some extra content and some refinements. That release is important though, because it shows the game had real weight where it started. It had enough of an audience to justify getting expanded. And when you zoom out, the reason Clock Tower exists is pretty clear. It hit during a period where horror on console still had room to experiment, and Human Entertainment used that space to build something around suspense. Adventure game structure holding it together, a vulnerable protagonist, a mansion that feels like a trap, and a tone pulled from classic horror cinema. The whole idea here is simple. Fear can carry the experience as long as the atmosphere and the pacing stay tight. Clock Tower really explored helplessness before the genre had a clean name for it. When you start actually playing the game, Scissorman changes the whole pace. The game has you moving through the mansion like an adventure game, exploring, clicking around, solving little puzzles, and trying to figure out what the place even wants from you. And then he shows up, and that calm rhythm gets pressure added to it. It adds this feeling that you can't really settle in for too long, and it hits the way it does because Jennifer only survives by getting away. Hiding and escaping is really the only tools she has. Exploration and puzzle solving stay at the center, and then panic can kick in when she gets scared. So you start moving through rooms differently. You walk in and check where exits are. Every time you interact with something, you're already thinking about where you'd run or hide if he drops in. That's really the backbone of the experience. After Scissorman shows up once, you play with him in the back of your mind the entire time. And then you get into the panic button, which is one of the coolest parts of the whole system once you understand it. I feel like a lot of people hear panic and think it's just the game telling you Jennifer is scared. And yeah, that's part of it, but panic is also how you survive direct danger. When you get caught or pulled into a struggle moment, you have to tap the panic button to break free, kind of like the older Resident Evils when something grabs you. It's the same idea when you're trying to climb something in a tense moment or force your way through something that you wouldn't normally survive. You click what you need, you panic, and that's Jennifer pushing herself through it. It becomes an adrenaline mechanic. It's the game's way of letting you fight back without giving you a weapon. And all of this is just buying you time. You don't really win most of the encounters, you just survive. Forcing distance, scrambling out, pushing away. Stamina is what ties all that together, because it affects how well Jennifer can survive those panic moments. Her state shows up around her portrait, almost like a health bar, and you can watch it change as she gets worn down. Running through halls, getting chased, stressful moments. All that drains it, and when Scissorman catches you, the stamina is very important, because those escapes get a lot harder when she's already drained. So you start treating stamina like a resource. You start walking more than you want to, you save energy. Sprinting stops feeling free, because running helps you right now, but it leaves you worse off later. And that's where the tension really sets in. You're trying to solve the mansion, but you're also keeping Jennifer steady enough to survive the next Scissorman encounter. And then there's the way Scissorman can feel a little different across playthroughs. Clock Tower has multiple endings, and the game expects you to replay it. So the danger doesn't always line up in the exact same way every time. Where you go, what you trigger, what order you do things in, all that can change when the danger shows up. After a couple of runs, you feel that unpredictability. You never fully relax. Even when you know the mansion better, you still move like something could chase you at any moment. The sound plays into that too, and it's one of the cleanest tools the game has. Scissorman's scissors has a very specific scraping, snipping sound, and it carries through the mansion. A lot of the time, you hear it before you see him, and the second you hear it, your brain goes into alert mode. Whatever you were doing in the room gets pushed to the side. You're trying to remember what hiding spots you've seen, how far down the hall you are, listening to see if he's behind you or in front of you. That sound teaches you to listen like it's part of survival. After a while, you can feel your habits changing. You scan rooms faster, you don't hang around as much. You pick hiding spots on purpose because if you pick the same one over and over again, Scissorman will end up finding you. You keep an exit in mind during the quieter stretches, and you watch your stamina so you're not dragging into the next chase. The game keeps reinforcing that loop. Explore, stay alert, solve what you can, and be ready to move. That's what Scissorman does in Clock Tower. He takes that slow, methodical adventure structure and adds pursuit pressure to it. Hey, just real quick, if you made it this far, I appreciate you hanging out with me for a bit. If you're enjoying the video, consider subbing. There's a lot of content like this on the channel and there's always more coming. And if you want to help out, leaving a like and dropping a comment goes a long way also. Let me know what you think about Clock Tower, if you played it, how you felt about it. Or if this is your first time seeing it, I'd still like to hear what you think about it so far. But alright, let's get back to Clock Tower. Now that we've talked about Scissorman and how the game keeps you on edge, let's get into the mansion itself, because the house is doing a lot more work than it looks like at first. After you spend a bit of time running around, you start to see the mansion feels different. Clock Tower uses the house as a structure you move through again and again. And the more you replay it, the more you realize the mansion keeps changing just enough to mess with your memory. A big part of that comes down to item placement. The game changes where certain items show up between playthroughs, so you might remember finding something in one spot, then on the next run you check the same spot and it's empty. You still end up in familiar rooms, but the game keeps you searching, it keeps you paying attention. And it goes beyond just items. Certain danger spots and hiding spots can change too. There's even a whole section of the mansion, the West Wing, that can shuffle around between runs. That's a pretty big deal because it keeps the mansion from turning into something that you can just run on autopilot. Hifumi Kono, the creator of Clock Tower, He talked about stillness being important to him, and you can feel what he meant once you're actually in the mansion. The game gives you these long, quiet stretches where you're walking, listening, just clicking around, checking rooms. That calm time has a purpose. It gives you room to focus and search and make decisions without being rushed. And because you get that breathing room, the moments where things actually happen land a lot harder. So the mansion starts feeling like a puzzle box. The rooms are important, but the bigger thing is how the rules stack up over time, and how the house keeps you paying attention. Another big layer is the way events depend on order. A lot of things in this game work like a chain. You trigger one scene, and it changes what can happen next. Some events can happen more than one way. Some discoveries show up differently depending on what you've already done. And once one version happens, the other version usually disappears for that run. And it does this in a really old school way sometimes. You'll go into a room, leave, and come back, and an event finally happens. You're basically testing the mansion to see what it reacts to. After a while, the house starts feeling like it has different states, like it's shifting forward based on where you've been and what you've already triggered. All of that feeds directly into the endings. Clock Tower has 9 endings, and the mansion structure supports that. The ending you get depends on what you found, what you triggered, and what order certain things happened in. Some outcomes only open up after you've uncovered the right information and pushed the right chain forward. So reaching the end comes down to what you actually learned and what you carried into the final stretch. That's why the story side of this game stays tied to exploration. Jennifer is trying to understand what's going on with Mary and what this mansion even is, and the game treats that truth like something you uncover over time. You can move forward and still miss key context, and that affects where everything lands later. Mary is a big example of that. The game cares about what you actually figured out while you're moving through the house. It keeps nudging you towards certain rooms and certain discoveries, like records with her name on them, because those details fill in what's really going on. And the actual clock tower side works the same way. The final stretch connects back to what information you found earlier. When you reach it with the right pieces in place, the path lines up better and the ending feels more complete. So after a couple playthroughs, you start seeing what the mansion's really doing. Each run teaches you something different. Sometimes it's learning how the rooms connect, sometimes it's noticing which items shift locations and where they tend to show up. Sometimes it's seeing an event play out in a different order because you went somewhere else first. After a couple of runs, the mansion starts feeling like an escape room that resets a little each time. That's a big reason Clock Tower stays so interesting. It keeps giving you new little problems to solve, even when the overall setting is the same. Clock Tower tells its story in small ways. A lot of it comes through what you find and what you piece together while you move through the house. You get the basic situation up front, and then the rest fills in through discovery. You play as Jennifer Simpson. She's a teenage orphan from the Granite Orphanage in Romsdal in Norway. She arrives at the Barrows estate with 3 other girls from the orphanage, Laura, Anne, and Lotte. They've been adopted by a wealthy man named Simon Barrows, and they're brought to his home. This isolated mansion people call the Clock Tower because of the tower built into the estate. The person guiding them is Mary. She's the adult in charge of the move, the one leading the girls into the house and directing them. After they arrive, the group gets separated, and Jennifer ends up alone, trying to find the others and understand what's going on inside the mansion. That's really the surface level setup. Jennifer alone in a huge house trying to find the other girls and figure out what's happening. And then Scissorman enters the picture. Scissorman is Bobby Barrows. He's tied to the Barrows name and tied to the mansion itself. And as you keep moving through the game, you get this sense that he isn't just some killer in the house, he's part of what happened here. As you explore, you start running into signs that the mansion has an occult layer underneath it all. There's a church-like area with ritual imagery, objects and symbols that point towards worship and ceremonies, not normal life. How clear the story feels depends a lot on what you uncover in a run. 2 of the bigger branches involve Simon Barrows and Jennifer's father. In some routes, Jennifer can find Simon alive, locked away in the estate. In other routes, she finds something a bit heavier, her father's body in a hidden room. That discovery comes with a letter, and it fills in a lot of the missing context. It connects Mary directly to what happened in this house. It connects her to the twins. It also puts a real timeline on everything. Her father's death is dated November 10th, 1986, after being trapped for days. And once you hit that branch, Mary's role becomes a lot clearer. The story starts framing her as the person you're trying to understand. Jennifer's bigger goal turns into figuring out Mary's intentions. Who she is, what she's been doing inside this mansion, and why these girls were brought here in the first place. And then you reach the second twin. Bobby is the Scissorman, but the other twin is Dan Barrows. And Dan is where the game leans fully into body horror and the supernatural. Dan shows up in the underground areas as this terrifying giant baby demon, something that pushes the story past human killer in a mansion and into this house has been used for something unnatural. Dan exists as proof that the occult layer wasn't just decoration. The ritual side had consequences, and those consequences are still alive underneath the estate. From there, the story starts steering towards the clock tower itself. The tower is your final weapon. In the late sections of the game, Jennifer can reach the clock tower mechanism and trigger the switches. The chimes go off and the tower activates. That moment ties directly into how Bobby, the Scissorman's story, ends in most of the bigger endings. What's interesting is how quiet the game keeps all of this. In 1995, a lot of horror in games leaned on visuals and simple setups. Clock Tower went for something more layered. It lets the story sit in the background and it expects you to uncover it through the mansion itself. So the plot ends up feeling like part of the house, like you're digging up history while you're trying to survive it. So now that we've gone through what the game is, it really helps to zoom out and look at how Clock Tower actually landed when it came out in Japan. Because the simplest way to say it is, Clock Tower found an audience. This wasn't a game built to appeal to everyone. It sat in a very specific lane. The slow pacing, tension built around being chased, and point-and-click structure. That kind of game tends to travel through word of mouth more than hype. And when you look at reception, you can see that, and it lines up. On the critical side, it's reviewed well for what it is. Famitsu scored the Super Famicom release in 31 out of 40. Which is a pretty strong sign that it was taken seriously as an idea. That doesn't mean every reviewer thought it was perfect though, but it does mean the game landed as something worth paying attention to, especially for a title that was doing something a little different from what most console games were doing in '95. On the commercial side, the clearest description that I could find from the creator was that it sold fairly well, and that makes sense. It wasn't built to be a mainstream blockbuster. It did enough to justify itself, prove the concept, and build reputation. But that reputation is the key part here. A couple years later, it comes back on PlayStation with a little bit of extra content and refinements, which tells you there was demand for it. A company doesn't go back and expand a niche horror adventure game unless they believe there are people who want more of it. That PS1 version even charted in Japan at release, and it moved a real number of copies in its release window. So you're looking at a game that built enough momentum in its home market to justify a second run, on stronger hardware with more material. And it's pretty interesting because even the PS1 reception paints a pretty clear picture. It still wasn't a universal, everyone agrees kind of game. Dengeki PlayStation, which was a Japanese publication kind of like Game Informer, scores with them landed in that mixed to positive range depending on the review, which again, makes sense for what kind of game this was at the time. But the people who clicked with that rhythm tended to respect it a lot. People who didn't probably bounced off really fast. So the way it landed in Japan makes sense when you consider what it actually is. Clock Tower feels like one of those games that gets remembered because it has a very specific identity. People who clicked with it had a reason to talk about it. Different endings, routes, and different things you could miss. It didn't need to dominate sales charts to become important inside Japan's horror space. It just needed to prove the idea worked. This kind of tension and pacing, this kind of fear built around pursuit and discovery. The fact that it came back as the first Fear on PlayStation is the clearest sign that this game earned a following where it started. A lot of people look back now and call Clock Tower one of the pioneers of survival horror. And for a Super Famicom game from 1995, that's a pretty heavy label. But when you actually break down what it's doing, the fear built around pursuit, weak protagonist, story you uncover through exploration, the multiple endings, replay baked into the structure, it makes sense why people put it in that category. It shows up early, before the genre had a clean set of rules everybody agreed on. Resident Evil hits in 1996 and becomes the big "this is survival horror" moment for pretty much everyone. Silent Hill comes later and defines its own lane with psychological horror and a specific tone. Clock Tower sits right before both of those waves, doing its own kind of groundwork. It's basically testing a simple idea. Fear gets stronger when the player doesn't have much power, and the threat can interrupt you at any time. Scissorman is a big reason that legacy holds up. When people talk about Stalker enemies now, everybody jumps to the modern examples. Resident Evil has a bunch of them: Mr. X, Jack Baker, Lady D. Characters who show up and change how you move through the game. You start planning routes, thinking about doors, listening for sound cues. You play with that dread of being chased in the back of your head the entire time. Clock Tower has an early version of that feeling, because Scissorman is basically a blueprint for pursuit-driven fear. He can cut in while you're exploring and force you to react immediately. And once he shows up, the house feels different, even when he isn't on screen. And that idea carries forward into a whole branch of horror. Games built around being hunted and surviving through evasion fit into a line that Clock Tower helped shape. You can see the same mindset show up in things like Amnesia, Outlast, Alien Isolation, and tons of other games. There's different errors in presentation, but it has the same core idea. You're moving through an environment with a threat that can show up at any time and just take control. And that brings us to the other big legacy point: vulnerability first design. Clock Tower builds fear by keeping the player small. Your main options are movement, awareness, hiding, and timing. The game doesn't give you a toolset that turns the tension off. You get systems that let you survive moments you barely make it through. That panic input in particular is a great example, because it's basically the game's version of a struggle mechanic. When something grabs you, you have to fight back with smashing a button. You can see that same kind of thinking show up later in other survival horror games, especially early Resident Evil. A zombie grabs you, you're mashing to break free. It's that same get off me moment. You're not really trying to win those encounters, you're just trying to survive and get away. Clock Tower was already building around that kind of escape action really early, and it fits right into why the game still feels important today. Another part of Clock Tower's legacy is replay. This game gives you a reason to run it back. You've got multiple endings, variables that shift, a mansion that rewards learning it over time. So after one run, you're already thinking about what you missed. After 2 runs, you're comparing outcomes. You start noticing patterns, noticing differences, and it naturally turns into one of those games people talk about because everybody's run ends a little differently. So when you look at Clock Tower now, it ends up sitting in a really important spot in horror history. It's early survival horror groundwork, it's pursuit-driven fear built around a stalker presence, vulnerability as the core experience, and its replay built into the design, where understanding the game gets you further. And then there's the preservation side of it, which is huge for this game. For a long time, the original Clock Tower was really hard to get. It stayed in Japan, and outside of that, it mostly existed through imports, fan translations, and word of mouth. A lot of people knew the name before they ever had a real way to sit down and play the original for themselves. The modern release changes that. The first Clock Tower is officially available in English now, and is playable on modern platforms, which is a big deal on its own. It means you can get to it easily now, without hunting down obscure copies or relying on workarounds like emulation. You can actually play it, see how it works, and understand why people talk about it the way they do. And it's not just a straight port. The updated version adds new animated scenes and quality of life improvements. There's a lot of really cool things in it. So it lands better for a modern audience while still keeping the core intact. It feels like the game got preserved, not replaced. That ties right into what this channel is about. Stuff like Clock Tower deserves to stay alive, to be playable, to be understood in context. Not just remembered as a name people mention in horror discussions. When you really step back from all that, Clock Tower belongs in a small group of games that helped build horror into what it is now. Sweet Home, Alone in the Dark, and then this. The genre got bigger and cleaner later, but a lot of the foundation starts right here. Well, that's Clock Tower. If you made it all the way to the end, I really appreciate you hanging out with me for a bit. If you enjoyed the video, consider subbing, dropping a like, and leaving a comment. Let me know what you think about Clock Tower, if you ever played it before, or if this is your first time seeing it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And I appreciate you all for supporting the channel. Thanks again. But as always, I'll see y'all later.